Regis and Kelly, and you should go to her website, and we can. I'll just give it to you now. It's pattiwood.net, and you can get a clip of her in bed with Regis and Kelly, the three of them. It's kind of funny. But in any case, so we're going to get to a promise that Patti has made in her life. It's I know a little bit about the story, and but I want her to tell it. And so, Patti, I mean, you don't have to jump right into it, but I always start with our guests and ask them, what's your promise? So we'll get to that. Patti, so welcome to the program, and I really appreciate your being here today.
Well, it's a real gift to be able to share this story and to be able to talk about my best friend, who I made the promise to.
Yes, and I know it's difficult sometimes to talk about really heartfelt promises. I know when I talk about the promise I made to my mother, I frequently get a little bit choked up about it because it was on her deathbed, and when I start thinking about it, it gets very emotional. So we may have a little bit of that. We'll try to just tell it like it is, because that's the importance of the promise. The power that I'm talking about is that it does connect to this emotional part of us that really virtually guarantees that we're going to do what we promised to do. So, Patti, what was the promise? You want to tell a little bit about the background?
I think part of it you need to know about my friend Roy and about how deep that friendship was and what a remarkable person that Roy was.
Right.
I met my best friend. I knew he was going to be my best friend immediately. Before my freshman year of college, I was at early orientation, and I looked across this huge room, and I saw this tall Nordic blonde leaning against a grand piano, looked at him, and immediately said, "Oh, my gosh, there's my life's best friend." Never met him before, but just immediately knew that he was going to be my very best friend. And I went over and introduced myself, and we ended up being best friends all through college. We'd take classes together, and Roy was an incredibly funny person, real silly and kind of goofy, which he was extremely attractive, so it was a very fun combination. And we were so close that if I was out and I wasn't with Roy, that my friends would say, how are you and how's Roy? Immediately we were just thought of as a unit, even years later, by people that didn't even know Roy. They would say, how are you, how's Roy? In fact, our relationship was so incredibly close, just as friends. It wasn't a romantic relationship in any way because Roy was gay. My roommate in grad school actually wrote for her master's thesis a novel based on our lives as roommates, and she tried to describe my relationship with Roy in her novel, and all of her professors said, this relationship doesn't make any sense. They're so incredibly close. They're like twins. And so, boom, she made us twins in the novel. And that, more than anything else, I think would define for your listeners what our relationship was like. We were like twin souls. And real silly, real fun friend. And when I went off to grad school, we still were talking constantly and visiting each other constantly when he moved up to Atlanta, and I was in grad school and working on my doctorate at Florida State. And I came up to visit him many years ago in Atlanta, and we were walking in Piedmont Park. If you know anything about big cities, they have Big City Park. It's a beautiful park with a lake. And we were walking around the park and doing what we always did. We were holding hands just as friends because we were just so beautifully, beautifully connected. And he turned to me and he said, Patti, I am dying of AIDS.
Oh, my God.
And I just screamed. And I even remember that the scream reverberated. It echoed across that lake. It was a horrific howl, really. And it was horrible. It was horrible. And he became ill very, very quickly. This was over 20 years ago. He was actually diagnosed with full-blown AIDS very early on in the history of AIDS in the U.S. And at that time, it's hard for, I think, sometimes for people to even get their head around what a stigma was attached to that disease at the time. I mean, it still exists. was horrible. It was really hard. In fact, my boyfriend at the time broke up with me when he found out Roy had AIDS.
Oh my
So
God.
you can...
Afraid that he would catch it or something.
Oh, yeah,
that was
somehow
part of it.
I would share a toothbrush or somehow even knowing it was a totally platonic relationship with Roy.
Right.
It was very, very difficult for Roy. He was a social worker, very filled with life, an incredibly giving person, and it's a testament to him that he had waited to tell me, even though I had to ask him, actually, when he had gotten sick, if he had AIDS, and he had denied it, because he couldn't stand the horror of watching me grieve for him.
Right.
And we, as he got sicker, had the conversation that involves actually promises on both our parts, because he was so very, very ill, and he could no longer eat. And so he was being fed intravenously in the last, I guess about 8 months of his life. And it was very gaunt. He was 6'2", and was getting down in his weight very significantly, and really wasn't sleeping, was in a great, great deal of pain. So we sat down with each other and held each other's hands, and he said, Patti, if I decide to let go, if I decide to unplug these IVs that are giving me sustenance, would you be able to bear that? Could you bear that? And I said I could. And I'd already made actually a promise that I wouldn't tell his family, because they were very prejudiced against his being gay, about his illness. So he asked for really an additional promise, and a really significant promise, that if he did that I wouldn't insist that they go to Herculean efforts to sustain him and plug him all back in again if that's not what he wanted.
Right. Yeah.
It was a really... It was such a hard conversation, because we were so close that I was very young. I was in my 20s. I can remember actually believing that when he died, I would die too. It just didn't even... I could not see a life without him in it. So I knew it was very difficult for him to make that request, because he didn't want to put me through any pain. But I said, I promise you that I will let you go. But I did exact the promise from him, and I asked him to please tell me and say goodbye. I just wanted him to say goodbye to me before he left, and that was the promise on both our parts, that I would not insist that he be revived. I wouldn't plug him back in. I would... he'd already had a conversation with his physician, and I knew the physician as well, a really very noble man who did all of Roy's treatments for free because insurance wouldn't cover him. So we had all of that arranged. And then would you like to know, would you want to know the specifics about what happened? I'm not sure where to go from here about the story.
Let me just ask, because that is a very powerful promise to make, and maybe of interest that you that Roy entrusted you with this kind of final decision. His parents, you said, weren't, or his family weren't too supportive or involved that much.
He was afraid, on many levels. He was afraid of the rejection he'd get. He was afraid that he had 5 sisters as well, and he was very afraid that they would try to keep him alive in a state he did not want to be in. Right.
So in the actual situation, we don't have to go into a lot of detail about it, but I guess, needless to say, that moment came
he did it very bravely. And again, it was a testament to what a strong, noble person he was, that I had taken a job as temp secretaries because I'm a professional speaker and I travel, but I didn't want to travel. And there was one job I made a commitment earlier, so I had to take it to do some law enforcement training. So I was out of town, but I went to see him before I left. And there was another conversation, which let me know that he was going to let go soon. And I actually wrote a letter saying that I loved him and that if he was holding on any longer for me because he saw the pain that was going to happen when he left, that I could bear that pain, that if he was in pain, it was okay if he let go. And so I wanted him to have that. And while I was gone, he unplugged his IVs. And he had a roommate. All this was, we had a lot of agreements about what was going to happen. And so when it came and the doctor finally told the family, and the family was there, I already had the arrangements with the doctor. I was able to share the plan and the promise with the family, and they honored that promise. They really came up to the bar and they honored that promise, which was extraordinarily difficult for them. And it was about a 2-week period.
Right, and they knew about your special relationship with Roy.
They absolutely did. Yep. And in fact, it was a real gift to me that they did recognize that, and they did give us a lot of time during that last period. And at his funeral service, they actually handed me his ashes and said that they knew Roy would want to be with me, which was a beautiful gift, really a beautiful gift.
Yeah. Well, this is I knew this would be difficult for you to talk about, and it's just one of those promises that come from the heart, and it involves the loss of someone so special. And really appreciate your sharing that with me. Now, if we can just kind of step back just a moment and think a little bit about this topic, the power of making a promise. Now, you say you promised him, and so you used that term, or you understood it to be a promise. And you didn't say, well, I plan to, or use some other term. It was a promise, which is the unique, kind of more binding sort of contract that this is all about. It's and that's the word that people use in these kinds of situations, which I think is why there is a unique power in making a promise. And I talk about the exact words you used. I call them the 2 magic words. I promise. And when you use those words in any kind of commitment, or maybe setting a goal, those are there's a magic about them. There's a power that is unusual and unique and really potent. And so that's what we're talking about here. You made a promise, and there's no way on earth you would somehow backtrack or not do it. I mean, that was your understanding, obviously, and Roy was part of it, and he made a promise back to you. So,
and I didn't share this, that he had promised to say goodbye, and even though he was in and out of consciousness, actually the family called me because I was away from the hospital for a few hours, and to come down because Roy was calling to me because he wanted to make sure that he thanked me for the promise being kept and to say goodbye to me. So it was a double promise, and he actually came back from we thought he was absolutely gone to make sure that his promise was kept as well.
Well, that again, we'll get to this whole point about the power of making a promise, and he took it very seriously, obviously, and so did you. And by the way, I think you were about to say, but I don't think it was clear to me anyway. Maybe listeners won't quite pick up on it. Now you mentioned your boyfriend, and you were living somewhere. Didn't you actually move down to be close?
What I was teaching at Florida State, and Roy lived in Atlanta, and so immediately that day in Piedmont Park that he told me he was ill, I started to make arrangements, and I moved to Atlanta so I could be with him that last year. And again, it didn't even occur to me that there was a choice in that matter. That was just, he was my best friend, and I wanted to be with him. Though he was a feisty guy, and I got this really inexpensive apartment that was big enough so I could take care of him. And he didn't want me to have to do that. He didn't want to burden me. But I was with him for that last year of his life.
And you, as I recall, hearing a little bit about this, you had a nice place in Atlanta. You were pretty well.
Oh, in Tallahassee before I moved up here. Yeah.
Or in Tallahassee.
I had a big old house
before you went to Atlanta. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a big old house in Tallahassee. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so it was a bit of a.
It's so funny to me because it took me a long time before I really shared the story, and actually the promise, I didn't really speak about that because it's only in the last few years that I think people could understand the kind of pain and suffering he was in, and for him to even want to make that choice.
Right.
But people would say, what do you mean? You gave up everything and you moved here and sold everything. I sold everything down to the walls.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
It's so funny because to me it was, I know this sounds weird, but I felt like it was a totally selfish act on my part because it was harder for Roy to watch me be in pain at his suffering than it was for me. We forget about that when somebody is ill and or dying. They're losing everybody, and we're losing one person. And so we often think about the caretaker being this noble figure, but in this case, Roy was the very brave one.
Right. Wow. Well, that's an amazing story. I really thank you for sharing it because I know it comes from the heart, and I think it's the poet Coleridge. I think it was Samuel Coleridge. I think it was who. Wrote something to this effect. I think I have the quote right. What comes from the heart goes to the heart. And if you share a story like that from the heart, it actually physically reaches in and touches our hearts, the people listening to the story. And I'm sure you've had, to the extent you've told other people about this, you've had that same experience.
Right. And I when I said it was a gift to be able to talk about this, it's really because it keeps that spirit of Roy, that knowledge that there was this person on the planet who was so loving and so giving. I would like the listeners to know he was just so special. When he was in we teased around a lot when he was in the hospital. He had this intravenous for his food, and we called it Wendy's drive-through, and we would just laugh and giggle. And this is a time where in some of the hospitals they wouldn't even come in his room because he had AIDS. And I'd be lying on the bed, and people would come, and he really, I believe, educated a lot of people in the hospital about how you could be with the disease.
Right.
We really, he was very much in life and happy that he could still be fun with me and have those times.
Yeah, well, just to remind people, you mentioned it, but I don't know exactly what year this was, but about 20 years ago it was.
Over 20 years ago, right.
It was like, AIDS was so scary. People were, very ignorant of the disease and didn't know how, or there was a lot of ignorance about how it was, how you caught it and whether you could catch it from the air and all kind, from different sort of, if you get a close contact, if you shook hands, people were afraid. So, you were right in that era when it was, before we knew anything about it. It was just a frightening kind of, people were, hysteria, I guess is a better word for it, kind of hysteria about it. And
I guess at that time, though the general public might not know about this, the government even had plans for camps and special places to take people with AIDS, which I think that sort of speaks to how horrified and scared and prejudiced people were about the disease.
Yeah. Well, that's from ignorance, and that's why education in general is so important. Ignorance breeds all kinds of crazy activities and misperceptions and misunderstandings and biases and prejudices, and so it's so important to learn about that particular disease and learn about other things that are going on in the world. Just be better informed, and that's hopefully that's what we'll do here. And you're helping to inform people about this relationship, which was obviously unique. I guess this is kind of a soulmate. I mean, you didn't use the term, but this obviously from the first moment.
Soul. Yeah,
your twin soul. It's incredible. It's an incredible story, and I know what you mean about talking about it, the promise, and how by doing that you kind of bring him back into the world. You get to share a little bit about him and his personality and your relationship and all the things that made him special. You get to talk about that a little bit, and it isn't just about the promise. And I know when I talk about the promise I made to my mother, it's really a tribute to my mother. The more I talk about it,
imagine your mother. When we were telling that story, I'm imagining a mother that was so confident in her love relationship with you that she could make that request and know that you would do it and that you could do it. That's amazing.